What's up, girls? Welcome back to my YouTube channel for a video that covers the 4 things I believe you should know about the Gospel of Matthew or the book of Matthew in the New Testament this summer. Here on my channel and on Twitter, I'm hosting a Bible reading plan. It's the Read with Anna Bible reading plan, and we're reading through the New Testament. So I want to do one of these videos to intro and give some quick info on each of the books we're going to be reading through this summer. But yeah, let's just go ahead and get into this topic. So, the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to cover 4 words that are overarching themes that I want you to be looking for as you're reading through the Gospel of Matthew. The first word is family. Matthew was written primarily to a Jewish audience, to the people of Israel. It was written by Matthew, also known as Levi, who was a tax collector and also a Jewish man. So this was different compared to Mark, Luke, and John, and we'll cover that when we do those videos in the future. But yeah, it was written to Jewish people. The Jewish culture really, really values family. You're going to see right in the opening chapter, Matthew chapter 1, you're going to read a genealogy of Jesus. This was important. It also is why you see repeatedly throughout this book Jesus being referred to as the Son of David. You will hear people calling Jesus the Son of David throughout this entire book, so be looking for that. That has to do with that whole genealogy aspect. Another aspect to the whole family focus of Matthew is that you're going to see Joseph featured more heavily in this gospel than in any of the other 3 gospels. You're going to hear about Joseph's perspective when he finds out that his fiancée Mary is pregnant, and you're going to see how Joseph takes care of Jesus as his earthly father. He, is listening when the Lord is speaking to him in dreams about, hey, you need to run to Egypt because Herod's going to kill the child and all this kind of stuff. So that's a cool aspect. Another interesting part that you can be looking for as you're reading through the book of Matthew is when Jesus makes a distinction that his followers, his disciples, are his true mother and brothers. People come to him and they're like, hey, your mother and brothers, they're waiting outside and you're in this crowd. You want to talk to them, blah, blah, blah. That's a paraphrase. But he says, you know what? These are my mother and brothers. And he's referring to his disciples. So that's really interesting because basically the Gospel of Matthew shows the Jewish audience that Matthew was primarily written to, even though us as non-Jews, we can also gain from it. Obviously, it's the Word of God. It's the absolute truth. And we want to learn about Jesus' life and ministry and what he said and taught. But what you can take away is that Jesus made a way to adopt non-Jews into the family of God. Israel is God's chosen people, but in Galatians we see how we have been adopted. The Greeks and the Gentiles, those people who aren't in the lineage or the ancestry or the genealogy of Jesus, it's possible for us to be adopted into the family of God and to be heirs to the promises of Abraham. So that's a really cool theme to be looking for as you're reading through the book of Matthew. The next overarching word that I want you to be thinking about and looking for as a theme as you're reading through the book of Matthew is the word prophecy. Biblical prophecy is used throughout this gospel. There's over 130 references to Old Testament prophecies about how Jesus would be the Messiah. Messiah is a big theme. The people of Israel have been looking for and longing for the King of the Jews who would come someday and save them from their overlords, their captors, the Roman Empire. And so they're looking for that and they're longing for that and they're yearning for that. And Matthew is making it clear to the Jewish people he's writing to, Jesus is the promised Messiah. And you can tell that he is by looking at all of these prophecies. Jesus himself, he tells people when they're looking for a sign about him, he says, well, no sign will be given to this generation except for the sign of Jonah. And what does that mean? It means that Jesus is going to be in the belly of the earth instead of the belly of a whale for 3 days. And then on the 3rd day, he's going to rise from the dead. And so they didn't understand it at the time, but Jesus was a fulfillment of that prophecy. John the Baptist is featured a lot in the Gospel of Matthew. And John the Baptist is definitely a prophetic figure. In fact, in chapter 17 of this book of Matthew, Jesus talks about how John the Baptist is actually the Elijah that was going to come before him and prepare the way for his ministry here on earth, for his work of salvation that he would be doing. And so that's really interesting to be looking for, is these prophetic references all throughout this book. Several other aspects to the whole theme of prophecy in the book of Matthew. One, Jesus really condemns the religious leaders of the past and the present and the future who killed the prophets, who were trying to warn them, hey, you are in sin, hey, this, that, hey, your error in your ways. And so he really goes hard on that. And then also at the very end of the book, Jesus gives a big teaching on the end times, on eschatology, on that whole like left behind type teaching that people get really excited about and stuff. So that is how the theme of prophecy is woven all throughout this book. The next word I want you to focus on as you're reading through the Gospel of Matthew is the word teacher. Jesus is portrayed throughout the book of Matthew as a good teacher, as a rabbi. He's teaching in the synagogues, he's explaining things, and he teaches in so many different ways. He teaches with examples and with practical instruction, like in the Sermon on the Mount. He gives the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, and then he also uses parables like crazy in this book. So you can be looking for Jesus as a good teacher. Also, you can be looking for Jesus to be contrasted. He's a good teacher, a good rabbi, and you can compare and contrast him against the wicked, evil, nasty, like teachers of the law that Jesus really calls out throughout this gospel. The teachers of the law, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they are the bad teachers and Jesus is the good teacher. One of the most interesting spots in this gospel where we see Jesus as a teacher is when he sums up all of the law and the prophets in 2 commandments. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, this sums up all of the law and the prophets, the Old Testament. He says, this is it. So he's really simplifying things, which is what a good teacher does. They simplify it. They make it easy to understand. They just help you to learn. So Jesus as a good teacher. The final word that I kind of touched on actually in this last one that I want you to focus on and look for as you're reading through this Gospel of Matthew is the word confrontation. You are going to see a lot of confrontation. Jesus is constantly calling out those bad teachers we just talked about, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders. He is calling them out. There's a whole passage where it's, if you have like a Bible that has like headings, it says the 7 woes. He says, woe to you, you teachers of the law and Pharisees. Woe to you, you brood of vipers. Woe to you. And he goes through like a laundry list of all the wicked things they are doing. And he basically says, you know what? You better cut this out because there are going to be people who are going to stand on Judgment Day and they're going to judge you. One, he said the people of Nineveh, you know Jonah, we talked about Jonah a second ago. Jonah, he preached to the people of Nineveh and they repented. But Jesus talks about how the people of Nineveh, they're going to stand up at judgment against the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, these brood of vipers and everything, and they're going to say, look, we repented. Why didn't you repent? He also said that the Queen of Sheba, or the Queen of the South, as some translations put it, she came to Solomon and sought out wisdom, but she's going to be standing there on Judgment Day against these religious leaders, and she's going to condemn this generation and say, I sought out wisdom and you rejected wisdom. That's a paraphrase again, but I think that's really interesting. He also, like I said, when we talked about him as teacher, he does a lot of practical teaching. He teaches about divorce. He teaches about conflict resolution. In Matthew 5 and in Matthew 18, Jesus gives really practical instructions about how to handle conflict. In Matthew 5, he talks about, hey, if you are at worship and you realize that your brother has something against you, you should leave your gift at the altar and you should go and make things right with him. You should reconcile with him. And in Matthew 18, it talks about that too. You'll also see some really interesting conflict between the disciples when you see that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, 2 of his disciples, their mom comes to Jesus and is like, hey, you know, let my sons be in your 2 most honored positions at your right hand and your left hand, actually right hand and left hand, whatever. But she says, let them be there. And he says, you don't understand what you're asking for. And then the disciples find out and they're really ticked. They're like, how come you're trying to get special treatment? Or, you know, again, paraphrasing, but there's that conflict and Jesus says, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, you have to be a servant. You can't be seeking this position of honor. If you want to be great, you have to be the servant of all. So there's so many different like points of conflict throughout this gospel. I think it's really interesting to be looking for that. It's in the other gospels too. And really that sums up the 4 words, the 4 themes I want you to be looking for as you read. And you can find all of those 4 themes in the other gospels, in Mark, in Luke, and in John, but you're going to see them even more like with more emphasis in the Gospel of Matthew in comparison to the others. Like you can do, there are people who have done word counts who have said like, you know, this is mentioned 130 times, the prophecies, the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. That's not mentioned nearly as often in Mark, Luke, and John. So I think it's really interesting to study this stuff. I hope you enjoyed this type of video. Give me some feedback in the comments below if you like this type of series, if you want me to keep going with the rest of the books in the New Testament. I'm planning on it, but if a lot of you say, hey, I'd rather stick to devotional content instead of this more like, study content, I totally understand, and I'd like to hear what you think. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Enjoy reading this week with the Read with Anna Bible reading plan, and I will talk to you in another video soon. Okay, bye.